I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone to our webinar, Extending Life Cycles, Reducing Risks, sponsored by Fullbay. I'm James Menzies. I'm editorial director at trucknews.com, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour or so. Today's discussion centers around the undeniable reality that fleets are extending truck and trailer replacement cycles in response to the ongoing freight recession, which is now in its third year. So happy anniversary to anyone that celebrates that. Shippers, I guess it would be. Not all fleets fully understand how extending equipment life affects their repair and maintenance costs or their risk profile. So I'm joined today by three gentlemen who do understand those issues and are here to share their insights. And I'll begin by introducing you each by name and title, and then have you tell us a little bit about yourselves. So we'll start with you, Brian. Brian Antonellis, CTP, is Senior Vice President, Fleet Operations with Fleet Advantage.
Hey, thanks for having me. Like you said, Senior Vice President of Fleet Operations for Fleet Advantage. For us, that means that I help procure the assets for ourselves and our customers, work with our customers throughout the life cycle, and make sure they have a good experience with a piece of equipment. I've spent about 25 years in fleet operations. I ran fleets for some very large companies down here in the US, and they're looking forward to this.
Great, well, thanks for being here. Peter Cooper is CEO of Ascend Consulting. Peter, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, so I'm Peter Cooper. I'm the founder and CEO of Ascend Consulting. And what we do here is we work with shops and fleets to help maximize their operation in the Bay, specifically really targeting things like tech efficiency and how productive we can be with those limited resources that we all have with technicians. This is my 26th year in the industry, and I have held almost every position from wash bay tech to CEO of a organization with multi-shops across multiple states.
Well, thank you for being here. And last but not least, we have Adam Wolk. He's Vice President of Fleet Maintenance with Canada Cartage. Adam, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, James. Thanks. Happy to be on board. I've been in the industry for, well, far too long, 30 years plus. And like other panelists, started in the entry level, changing oil and washing trucks, and then eventually moving on to larger and larger fleets. I've been at Canada Cartage for a year and a half now, and have really enjoyed just seeing shops and technicians and fleets progress and ultimately get really good results, and sometimes in not the best circumstances, like having to run equipment longer than you expected. But yes, it's a great career, and thanks for having me on board.
Well, thanks for being here. And just before we get started, it's clear that repair and maintenance costs are on the rise. ATRI, the American Transportation Research Institute, reported that Q1 repair and maintenance costs are up 2.8% over 2024. And I think this can in part be explained by the increasing trade cycles we're seeing throughout this downturn. And there are various reasons why fleets are hanging on to their equipment longer, and it boils down to, I think, uncertainty about emissions regulations, uncertainty about tariffs, and probably most of all, uncertainty about the economy and freight conditions. So let's get into this topic in a little more detail. And I'd like to start with you, Brian, since Fleet Advantage are known as the life cycle experts. What are you seeing in the market as it relates to equipment life cycles? And in your opinion, do most fleets or maintenance managers fully understand the relationship between extending equipment life and the repair and maintenance costs?
Yeah, I always like to start talking about what happens throughout the life cycle of an asset, right? And then to understand how that's going to affect your decision whether to extend or to keep your traditional trade cycle, right? So when you're thinking about the life cycle of a truck, obviously when you get it, it's very low cost. You're doing repairs like PMs, checking brakes, tires, the very routine type repairs. As it ages, the complexity of the repairs start to increase, the cost starts to increase, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So when we're thinking about whether it's the right decision to extend, you have to understand what that means. People will say, hey, I want to, not buy new equipment this year, or not acquire new equipment this year because I want to save money. Well, if you need to run the pieces of equipment, you need to understand if that's really going to save you money as you go through that cycle. Because when you have a 5, 6, 7-year-old truck, and it may cost you somewhere between R&M cost somewhere between $12,000 to $15,000 to maintain, where a new truck might be only $1,500 to $3,000 to maintain, right? So making sure that you understand that data, making sure you understand how your fleet ages, because it's different for everybody. Not every truck ages exactly the same. So you have to get down to your data understand what your cost curve looks like over time, and then make a decision around, if it is strictly a financial decision, is it really a good idea to extend your equipment? It might be, but I ask everybody to do that legwork and dig into your fuel economy and your R&M costs, and let's make sure you're making the decision that truly does save you money.
Okay. One of the advantages you have is that you're able to pull data from a vast population of vehicles, not just the vehicles from one fleet. That gives you access to a lot of numbers. So can you walk us through some of that data that sort of pinpoints the industry-wide costs of repair and maintenance as Class 8 trucks age?
Sure. So the slide that we're looking at here, this is an aggregate from hundreds of companies through, thousands and thousands of assets. We have 36,000 assets on the road. And what this shows is one company I picked in particular, and by the way, ABC is not the company. It got called out earlier. I just used that. It could have been 1, 2, 3. Okay. We're always looking at what the industry cost is and what our customers' cost is. So we're connecting into their shop maintenance software system. We're pulling their data, and we're not just pulling it as cost. We're pulling it by VMRS code. So we're looking to understand exactly what you're spending by model year, by OEM, even breaking it down to if you had a different powertrain selection, right? To understand what that is, and then how it compares to the industry, and how is your truck's age, how that cost is reflected, and what decisions you can make. So if you look here, if we had a 2026 model year truck, right, it's going to cost us about, somewhere around 3 cents a mile to run. When I talk about this math, it's easier just to say, hey, listen, it's a 100,000 mile truck, just as an average. That's going to cost you in year one about $3,000 to maintain it. That's your preventative maintenance, your checks, maybe some tire replacement for accident or incident, but it's going to be a fairly low cost. As you move out to year 5, so if we look at the 2020s, that is now costing $5,200 or 52 cents a mile to run. So when we talk about starting to extend equipment, you notice that curve is very linear for quite a while. So you start to get out to year 5 or 6. It seems to step up. As you start to get out to year 6 and you jump up to $5,600 a year or 56 cents a mile, and then up to 8 cents a mile, 8.5 cents a mile to $8,400 a year, all of a sudden you start getting erratic cost. So when we're in that decision point, if you're around year 5 and you're deciding, do I want to keep my truck or do I want to, replace it? This is the type of data you should be looking at. And you should be saying, okay, I know based on history that I'm running at about 52 cents a mile or $5,200 a year. If I extend to year 6, which would in this case would be like a 2019 model year, I know I'm going to go up about $400. So I need to budget for that increase, right? But when you go from year 6 to year 7, all of a sudden it jumps up to 8,500 or 8.4 cents a year, right? So those decision points are crucial. You have to either do something different or that's the cost you're going to expect. I mean, a couple of these panelists here are going to talk about different ways of managing shops and managing fleets. That cost isn't set in stone, but if you run the exact same program and you extend your truck trade cycle and you're caught on a big jump here for an R&M, it's going to cost you a lot more money. So you need to walk through the understanding of your current fleet economics, how it compares to the industry. Are you prepared to change your internal operations to defer any of that costs, right? And then make sure that you're making the right decision. Yes, there's some things you can do, but as you look at it, the costs are going to continue to go up. Once you get to that year 7 or 8, they start becoming non-linear. They start jumping around on you. Why? Because you're no longer doing brakes, lights, tires, PMs. You start doing transmission repairs and engine repairs and EPF replacements of components, and you start having $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 large charges that get placed in there, right? So overall, understanding what your maintenance curve looks like, understanding how each model year as it ages, how much it's going to cost you, and make sure that you're comparing that versus the decision you're going to make. Yes, getting a new piece of equipment is always going to cost you more. The cap cost of a truck 5 years ago is probably $30,000 cheaper than it is now. But you want to take that increased finance or capital cost and compare it versus the increase in maintenance cost. I think we're going to talk about it in a little while, the increase in fuel economy that you're going to save.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that. First, I want to mention that these slides are going to be available. We'll share them with whoever's on this webinar. You just mentioned fuel economy at the end because it's intuitive that repair and maintenance costs are going to go up as equipment ages. Talk about the effect on fuel economy as you run older tractors anyways.
So, you know, as fuel, people think that fuel economy is going to be flat across time. It's really not. You know, there's a couple of things that are happening here. One, the GHG mandates are pushing OEMs to improve their fuel economy by about 2% a year, right? So this chart here is actual fuel economy data that we've kept from 2017 until now. And then it really is projected based on the CAGR that we've seen over the last several years. So everybody's CAGR is going to be a little bit different, but I see them go between 1.9% up to about 2.5%, depending on the mix of fleet and the engine conversions that they've had, right? But so the industry is improving at about 2% a year. What happens to an individual truck? Individual truck, if it's a 2020 model and was getting 7.13 MPG, year one through probably year four, assuming it's 100,000 miles a year, that truck is going to get somewhere around that 7.1 miles per gallon. When you start to get somewhere around 450, 500,000 miles, you're going to start seeing fuel degradation, which means the engine's just not as tight as it once was. It's not performing the way it did when it was brand new. So you're going to start seeing a little bit of a downturn in fuel economy. So if you think back to what we talked about in R&M cost, in year one, a vehicle is going to cost you about $2,500, $3,000 a year to maintain, which is 2.5, 3 cents a mile on 100,000 miles a year. If you compare that versus a 5-year-old truck, which is somewhere around $10,000 to $12,000 a year. Now you look at the fuel economy, so there's already a gap of probably $12,000, $13,000 a year on the R&M side. Come over to the fuel economy, your current vehicle's getting 7.1. We know if we run another year, that's probably going to go down to 7. Jump forward to a 2026 model year, they're getting 8.4. Right, so now we're seeing a substantial difference. Down the bottom, we try to break out what that looks like. So if we look at the 2017 models versus a 26, the average monthly savings in fuel is about $1,000 or $12,000 a year. And that's really the math you have to do. So yes, it might cost you $300 or $400 a month more to buy or procure another asset, but you're avoiding that cost of a lower performing MPG on an older unit to the tune of about $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year. And you're also avoiding that high end of the R&M cost curve where you start paying over 10 cents a mile, somewhere in that $12,000 to $15,000 a year range compared to the $3,000. So that's why I always go back to, there's a functional obsolescence of a truck. Listen, trucks today are so much better than they were. You can run them 1,000,000 miles if you want. But what we try to target and what we ask everybody to look at is, don't look at the functional obsolescence of your truck. Look at the economic obsolescence of your truck. So when does it make more sense to take advantage of that improvement in fuel economy that we've seen over the past 10 plus years? Control your maintenance curve so you're not necessarily exiting when you're at the highest end of it, and really find that perfect point when you should be replacing your equipment. No, I think back to that slide that had the R&M curve on it, and I think about, we look at that as from a dollar perspective, but there's also the reality of how you have to manage that additional cost. So if you had your own technicians and that truck in year 1 through 4 was only requiring $3,000, $4,000 in labor to stay on the road, as that moves up, you're going to have more technicians. You're going to have to outsource. You're going to have to manage the output of keeping that vehicle a little bit longer. As I go through this with people, they go, so you're telling me we should never extend a piece of equipment. We should always replace it. What I'm telling you is you have to understand how it's going to impact your business from a technician side, from a training side, right? And make the right decision for you. I understand at some point that capital investment or that acquisition isn't possible. but understand how that's going to affect you. We saw this during COVID when trade cycles were extended in 2021, 2022, and 2023 because people couldn't acquire equipment. Yeah, their costs went up. They may have been used to paying a cost internally of $40 or $50 an hour for their internal technicians. But when those repairs became more complex because they had never worked on 600,000 or 700,000 mile trucks before, and we had engine rebuilds and transmission rebuilds, and you had to go to a third-party network, now you're paying $125 or $150 an hour. So my answer to everybody is, I'm not telling you to replace or extend. I'm telling you that we should do the homework to make sure you understand the impact of your decisions from a MPG standpoint and from a repair and maintenance standpoint, and then think about how those two numbers are going to affect your broader organization. Training, staffing, right down to how many bays that you have to make these repairs. So open up the conversation, dig into the data, and let's make sure you make the right decision.
Very well said, Brian, and a lot to digest. And you set us up perfectly as we take the conversation now into the shop. And Adam, I'd like to turn to you. You were not long ago, you were running one of Canada's largest line haul fleet, and now you're running a regional fleet in Canada Cartage. I would assume just by the nature of the work, you've inherited a fleet that's maybe a little more better utilized. What have you learned about equipment life cycles as you've made that transition from line haul to regional haul?
I'll fall back to one of the points that Brian made earlier. Not every asset ages the same. It's a much bigger exposure if I have a tire failure, or for that matter, a brake failure 100 kilometers outside of Nipigon, Ontario, on one of the west fronts, than if I have the exact same perhaps on the 401. One entails a very expensive vendor visit and perhaps a tow. The other one, it's not as much of an exposure. Managing cost is also about managing risk. Every fleet's different. Like Brian said, you got to know your fleet, you got to know your application, you got to know your costs. One of the things I look at is total cost of ownership. You roll it all into one. Line haul fleet's not going to be the same as a regional fleet. Sometimes even within parts of a regional fleet, it's different. You can have two trucks doing the exact same number of kilometers in a day, and one's doing, a 10 drop milk run, and the other one's doing a point to Windsor and back. Same truck, same number of kilometers, one's going to incur more costs. So it is very application, customer, and fleet specific for sure.
Okay. We are having questions come in. We're going to save those till the end, but anyone that wants to get a question in, please feel free to enter it at any time. Adam, a lot of maintenance managers are under pressure from the C-suite to reduce costs in an environment like this. We just heard from Brian how complex a decision it is to actually decide to extend equipment life. So how do you manage that yourself?
Well, it's easy. You just call up your CFO and you sandbag your budget by about 15%. He accepts it and you argue. No, I'm just kidding. Seriously though, you respond, again, building on what Brian said, a lot of facts. You respond with facts and data. You mentioned ATRI and their aggregation of cost data earlier. They will give a macro view to fleet costs in various categories. They base that information on polling thousands of fleets and their individual cost trends. Just as ATRI bases their information on that data, fleets need to do the same. Data is but one part of the puzzle. Data turns into information. In order for the data to turn into information that you can action, it has to be accurate, has to be clean. Fight to ensure that your data, as it goes into your system, is clean. Brian mentioned VMRS before, Vehicle Maintenance Reporting System. It's absolutely key that you need to have your costs associated appropriately via VMRS. And then that in turn with utilization data gives you that gold standard, which is cost per mile or cost per kilometer up here in the Great White North. Good utilization data, good handle on your maintenance costs, and you turn that into the right information to make decisions. That information will give you accurate costing, which will drive to your total cost of ownership, and then you can respond to your CFO where and in which applications you can extend those life cycles and where it would probably be false economy.
Okay. Peter, you're a shop efficiency consultant, and you have indicated that when it comes time to become more efficient in the shop, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that can be picked before you get into extending life cycles. Can you tell us a little bit about what those opportunities are?
Yes, there are. some pretty easy things that are go-to that are pretty prevalent across the industry. One thing I want to mention to build on what Brian mentioned is that I think we're in a reality where fleets are extending their life cycle, and all too often they're not looking at what it takes to maintain a truck. And it's not just an issue of, well, we have X number of mechanics, we've always been able to maintain this many vehicles before. You have to look at the quality and qualifications of that technician. When you're working on a truck with 700,000 miles, you need a different type of repair. You're no longer doing simple repairs like oil changes and wheel seals. Now you're doing advanced diagnostic, whether it be electrical, whether it be engine, whether it be after treatment. So I think that has to be something that has to be looked at. But from an efficiency standpoint, most fleets do not look at their labor as a revenue generating stream. If you use the same logic that a for hire shop would use, and you look at what you get out of your employees, it would really change what you're actually getting and the cost to maintain these vehicles. And we'll use an example here. Most shops that we've seen are truly operating at about 50%. So if you really start pulling it, use the RMS codes, and you look at what the task the technicians are performing, there's a lot of lost time. So you talk about low-hanging fruit. One of the simplest things, most easiest things to do in a shop is just get rid of verbal communication. Verbal communication is one of the most inefficient ways to transmit data. An example of that is the tech stops what he's doing, gets out from under the truck, goes into the supervisor's office, waits for the supervisor to get off the phone, just asks a simple question like, which PM service are we on? Or is this a ABC PM? When you could very easily send a message. Or the technician leaves because he's tired of waiting. So then we have the person leave the office, and then they go and bother the technician, which interrupts his time even more. An example of that is you could easily just use some type of internal chat or messaging system. We find that actually gains, believe it or not, hours per week just in that lost walking time. And one of the ways we prove this scientifically is we put pedometers, step monitors on technicians, and the reduction in steps actually brings an increase of production. So I think that's something to actually look at. Another easy tip for, almost every phone tracks this now, whether you know it or not. You can look at that data and actually get some good usable out of it. Another example of this is the amount of money that it costs to maintain these vehicles in downtime. If we can increase what technicians are capable of doing, in other words, the level of repairs, we're not outsourcing it as much, but also if the technician's more efficient, we don't need as many technicians. A lot of shops are actually overstaffed, even though they think they're not. They always want to hire more techs. They want to hire better techs. You ultimately don't need as many techs as you think you do if you can get their efficiencies up.
So going from 50% efficiency to 80% efficiency obviously would be beneficial. What tools are you using in the shop or recommending they use in the shop for communications to cut down on that walking time and the verbal communication? Is it phone or?
Honestly, whatever works for you. Some shops it is phone. I don't always encourage that because there's other distractions that come along with that. I generally try to stick to an internal messaging system. So if you're using Microsoft, Teams is part of that suite. If you're using Google, then they have Google Chats part of that suite. But there's other things you can use like Slack. They're fairly inexpensive. And you start looking at this as a cost per technician. And a couple of dollars a month for this chat program is way cheaper than having to hire another technician.
Okay. As you become more efficient, you affect the impact, you impact the repair turnaround time. I think you have a slide that you wanted to demonstrate that.
Correct. So this is another thing that we're seeing that's happening in the fleets. As we're extending life cycles of these trucks, the repairs actually take longer and longer. And now on top of that, now you need more techs, where a lot of fleets can run 10 units per one tech when they're a fairly well-maintained under 500,000 mile fleet. Once you start going above that, now you're needing anywhere between 13 to 15, you're needing about 7 or 8 units is all one technician can manage with these larger repairs. A service is an hour job, but yet we go from that to needing clutch replacements. Now we're in a 10+ hour thing. So your time that you need from technicians increases. And with that, fleets are missing a lot of runs, or they just flat out have to have too many units. So some fleets are hanging on to even older units, keeping them back as spares, which is increasing this cost even higher and higher, ultimately because they just can't get the units out the door.
Okay. Back to you, Adam. I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the measures you've taken through this freight downturn in order to become more efficient in the shop, and then whether or not you've extended equipment life cycles, and if so, how did you approach that?
We manage our repairs through a mix of internal shop resources, technicians and bays across the country, as well as external vendors. And like previous comments, we're always striving to do as much as we can in-house because your own internal labor is always going to be less expensive. At the end of the day, it's knowing your costs, know all of your costs, whether it's technician labor and the utilization of a technician, how many hours did you pay your tech versus how many hours did he produce for you, as well as his efficiency. You know, when you get into, as we were talking about earlier, VMRS, VMRS comes with a wonderful part of it, standard repair times. What is a appropriate time to replace a set of brake shoes? How long does it take to rebuild an engine? How long does it take to do an oil change and inspection? All of those things. So you need to measure all of that. So know your costs, know all of your costs, technician costs, what it costs to buy a truck. You know, what is that capital cost? What is your expected residual value at each stage? If you're going to keep a truck 3 years and then dispose of it at 400,000 miles, you're going to get a certain residual value. If you keep a truck for 6 years and you're going to dispose of it at 800,000 miles, that's going to be a different residual value. You take all of that and put it into a bucket and stir it up, and you're going to get your total cost of ownership. You got to get the fuel economy as well. Every fleet is going to have a different total cost of ownership. And sometimes those costs can be a little bit more difficult to measure, like, breakdown time. You've got to pay your driver for that breakdown time, but you're not going to be able to bill it back to the customer. It may not fall on your particular line item if you're in a maintenance environment like mine, but you have to be aware of it. Driver turnover. If you've got newer trucks versus older trucks, it is not free to get a driver to walk in your door and sign on with you. So your HR people, they're a cost as well. You got to put that all in there, and some of it can be rather difficult to measure, accurately. You may think you have a plan to save a bunch of money on a certain part of the fleet, but if that negatively impacts you on a different part of your statement, or negatively impacts your customers, and you have customer attrition, which is the worst, you might be, as we say up here in the north, tripping over toonies to pick up nickels. So know all of your costs and make sure you're taking it all into account.
I love it. Well said. You're obviously a very data-driven maintenance director. Not all fleets are sophisticated, especially smaller fleets. What words of wisdom do you have for those that just might indiscriminately during tough times extend life cycle of this tractor by 2 years or whatnot?
The analysis of that data doesn't need to be, crazy sophisticated. Yeah, we've got a maintenance system. We track all of our costs in it. But you could just as easily do that by pulling paper records and just adding your costs up on a manual Excel sheet or even a paper ledger if that's your thing, right? Everybody's comfort level is a little bit different. Know as best you can what your utilization is. Know as best you can what your costs are. If you can, try and get that into your different categories. Whether it's tires or brakes or engine rebuilds, as we said, and then try and measure that. The other, very big part is to work closely with your operations folks, the folks that move the freight. As I like to say in fleet maintenance, I'm a cost center. I don't make any money except when, on the odd rebillable type of event. So I have a very keen appreciation for my operations folks, my dispatchers, my drivers. They bring in the money that pays all of our paychecks and keeps the doors open. So listen to them. Drivers can be a huge resource. It's very important to have efficient shops and to measure all of your costs, but there's immense value in bringing your drivers on site, educating them, and having your drivers know the value of a very good pre and post trip inspection. They can save you a whole bunch of money if you listen to them and you work with them.
Okay. Peter, I'm sure you've seen it all as a consultant. Operations that run the gamut from very poorly run to very well run. What have you learned in visiting these fleets through the downturn when it comes to equipment life cycles, especially and how they're managing them?
I think one thing that is painfully obvious that the extending of life cycle, it can sometimes be a bit of a trap. And what I mean by that is that when you have an operations and a financial arm of the business that has made a decision that we're going to keep the truck for X, the maintenance department does certain things to try to make sure that truck just makes that life cycle. So they may look at brakes, they may look at engines, perfect example, engines and after treatment systems, and say, we know that we need to take DPFs out at X number of miles and do maintenance on them, because yes, DPFs are a maintenance item, and you extend that, and then unknowingly all of a sudden they make a decision to extend that life cycle without consulting maybe the maintenance department and asking what this is going to, how this is going to affect things. They don't realize that that's why the breakdowns are happening and why the costs have skyrocketed. So I think that's really something that it's communication internal with the fleet itself, is that you really need to have a plan. And I understand that plans change because none of us expected this freight market to last this long. But I think you have to look at it holistically on what have we done leading up to this, and can this truck survive this extended time period, and what will it cost?
Okay. Speaking of cost, I want to come back to you, Brian. We saw each other at American Trucking Association's Management Conference and Exhibition in San Diego recently. Some fantastic new trucks have come out over the last year or two. And then you see the price, and the sticker price can give you a little bit of sticker shock. Are you at all intimidated by the purchase price of these trucks, or are the efficiencies that they bring worth making those investments?
Well, I think it's a question we have to unpack, right? So just like we've talked about costs and understanding them year over year and being able to understand what piece they play into it. Listen, what we've seen is the cost of trucks in the last 3 years coming out of COVID have probably jumped $20,000. We have EPA 2027, and even though there's been some movement on the regulation, the investment's already been made by the OEMs. So, it depends how you think it's going to play out. Are we going to end up with somewhere between a $12,000 and a $25,000 cost increase? And that is, the hardware and software is going to be about $12,000 as we get towards 27. There's a warranty proposal that could add another $12,000. So you have these huge increase that we've seen and is projected. Now more than ever, we got to dig into the data. With those new engines, and the OEMs are going to push them into the market because they've already spent the R&D dollars on them. So with those new engines, we're going to have to go back and say, yes, we've seen an improvement in fuel economy. Yes, we've seen some safety features now become standard over the last 3 years that may have been an option before. We have seen trucks be able to push out the DPF maintenance intervals, right? But you're going to have to look at the data and say, what makes sense? So when I think about 27, I think about those changes. It's really about understanding the current economics of your vehicle today, knowing that there's going to be a dramatic change in 27. We've seen some of those engines out there under the legacy CARB rules already, and saying, how much of that new technology do I want to take at what time? How do I want to align my purchases to have some legacy technology, some new technology? And then how am I watching the costs, the MPG improvements, and finding balance? But listen, we've gone through a couple of cycles like this over the past 20 years where we had large cost increases, whether it was the first emissions, safety as it rolled out, and sort of the tried and true is you need to understand the economics of your current fleet. You need to take technology in manageable bites, because there's going to be change for everybody. There's going to be change for our drivers. There's going to be change for our operations teams. There's going to be certainly change for the technicians, right? And you don't want to go put 25% of your fleet in a new technology and force that down. Let's think about your purchasing cycle over the next, 36, 48 months, and let's strategically slot that technology to enter so you can absorb it from a cost perspective. You can get enough data to understand how it's performing and how it's going to affect whether, it's a product you're delivering in a private fleet or a customer that you're trying to pass the cost along to in a for-hire fleet. But it's about having a long view on it of at least 36, 48 months, planning it in, understanding how the technology is going to help you, taking it in manageable bites, and really controlling the situation to the best that you can. Something that scares me about extending vehicles today is we know we have this change coming in 27, right? It's actually 28 model year, but 27 calendar year. So if we defer acquisition of vehicles now, you're either going to have a large purchase in 26, right? Or you're going to have some of that bleed into 27. Then you're not going to be able to make that decision on how you want to absorb that into your organization. It's going to kind of get pushed at you because you're not going to have a choice. So go back to the data and let's make sure that we understand the efficiencies we're seeing on the new equipment, and then have a real plan of how you want to roll it into your organization.
Okay, and you didn't even mention tariffs, so it's not likely that there's going to be a scenario in which trucks become less expensive. Adam, I'd like to ask, are you seeing it on the road? Are you getting an ROI on the newer technology trucks?
We are mostly through reductions in fuel consumption, right? So certainly, the newer trucks also have better capability when it comes to data and telemetry. So we do have newer vehicles that are getting us our ability to, well, they come with a downside. You're getting a lot of alerts out of a truck. The truck is sending you an email that it thinks there's a problem. Some of the problems are, proactive, which is really, really nice because, there's various strategies in terms of maintenance. Used to be you were reactive. If something broke, then you fixed it. Then you tried to get, predictive in terms of the maintenance, such that you're going to be, putting preventive strategies in place. We're going to maintain this before it breaks. And then now that you're getting the data, it can actually give you an alert that it's getting close to an interval. So rather than have a sort of a fixed, we're taking that DPF out at 300,000 kilometers or 200,000 miles, you can get the truck actually tell you, no, I'm good. You don't need to take the DPF out of this truck until 400,000 miles because I'm a line haul application. So with that increased cost comes some increased sophistication, and as we said, better fuel economy. So yeah, it's a mixed bag. Cost more, but it is they are working to save money.
Okay. Peter, we haven't yet talked about safety, and that's a consideration as well when it comes to extending equipment life. When you look at a piece of equipment, what do you look for to indicate whether or not maybe that asset could be run another year versus no, it's really time that this is retired?
Honestly, there's not a lot of things that involve safety that have as much to do with life cycle as much as it has to do with capacity of the shop. I think a lot of things get missed because they get quote busy, or they get extended. Like, well, we're just busy today. We'll let those breaks go a little longer. And I think the data shows that. I mean, if you look at the the out of service criteria, over 25% of vehicles put out of service on roadside inspections are due to brakes. I don't really believe that has anything to do with life cycle. I think brakes wear out at 100,000 miles and they wear out at 1,000,000 miles. I think that solely has to do with the unintended side effect of, as we increase this life cycle, we have diminished our capacity to repair these vehicles in these facilities. And I don't think that's being recognized.
Okay, all right. Shifting gears here to trailers, the poor trailer, the box on wheels. Brian, trailers tend to get extended faster than anything because it's seen as a pretty simple, less complex piece of equipment than a tractor. Do you track the same numbers as you would and do the same theories apply to trailers as we talked about earlier on tractors?
Absolutely, they do. And yes, we track that data. That's a great picture right there. Actually, can you go back one slide? That's a great picture to look at, right? Because that's a good example. As you look through it, just like a truck isn't always a truck. It depends how you use it and its sort of vocation and the challenges it has to meet every day. These trailers aren't all the same here in this picture. So if you have a flatbed that may only get loaded once or twice a day, fairly regional, never meeting its max capacity. You have a dry box that's on the road 20 hours a day on teams, bumping docks all day, and then you have a refrigerated unit there. And of course, I'm making some assumptions on those, but it goes back to understanding your cost down to the VMRS code level, watching the cost curves on these individual assets as they age, and really looking at what is, if you have to make a decision, if you're in a situation where you don't have the capital allocation or you're not allowed to finance a new piece of equipment, you got to make a tough decision. Look at the costs, right? Not knowing what each of these vehicles do, obviously the reefer trailer there, you're gonna look at hours, not miles, right? But there's a lot of complexity there. They're typically, you'll get moisture on the inside. You have insulation that's getting heavy. You have a reefer unit that's running diesel fuel. So there's a lot of complexity in that unit, and you're going to have to be able to understand that cost. So understanding the cost in each of these different units, modeling it out year over year and watching how much they cost as they age, understanding how it's going to affect your customer base. It's the same as a trailer, but really the only difference is as you get towards those large costs toward the end of their life cycle, in a tractor you might see an engine or a transmission or an emission system. In a trailer on the reefer side, you're going to see the exact same thing, right? It'll look almost identical on the cost curve. On the flatbeds or the dry van trailers, you may start to see large components just fail. Cracking of cross members, frame rails breaking, bogies getting corrosion and starting to rot out. So each of them are going to have their own unique challenges. You should look at these assets individually, track the data, watch it over time, and make sure you make the right selection. So absolutely, in trailers, you're right, they're forgotten about, but the impact to making the wrong decision here can be really, it can be a challenge. So I'd say you should put as much effort into the data on your trailers to make that decision as you will in your tractors.
Okay. Adam, how are you managing your trailer life cycles, and what kind of specs go in on the front end to make sure that you can get a full life out of those trailers?
Trailers need to be spec'd out for their application, of course, as much as they need to be for their environment as well, right? I would absolutely spec a different trailer to move around, say, Arizona, than I would in terms of up here in Ontario or Quebec or the rest of Canada. We deal with a lot of cold temperatures. We deal with salt sprays that are put down on the road that are ruthlessly efficient at corroding absolutely everything, wiring, cross members, brakes, you name it. And that just ultimately that increases the cost. So from a spec standpoint, make sure it's able to do the work. And I don't know, as a general rule, we galvanize the heck out of everything. Standard steel isn't going to cut it anymore. It leads to reduced life cycles. As far as how long we keep a trailer, it's application specific. The heavier duty trailers tend to, have shorter life cycles. We also have some customers that demand age or term limits on trailers. So we have a few customers that are saying we're not going to take anything greater than 10 years. But in just standard sort of dry van, that nice standard box on wheels in the middle of the picture, we can extend them up to, in some cases 20 years. Now, I'm not going to take a dry van trailer and run it across country if it's approaching that age. You have sort of a progression of the life cycle of a trailer, right? You're going to have line haul, then you're going to have regional, then you're going to have local, then you're going to have storage. And we run them through all of those parts of their life cycle and deem it appropriate for what the customer needs. And to make sure that it's going to stay reliable. And the maintenance for those trailers, the maintenance programs are going to be appropriate to the usage of the trailer. We're not going to take a 15-year-old trailer and run it across country and not maintain it, that sort of thing. So got to be keyed, spec'd, and maintained appropriately.
Okay. Peter, we'll give you the last word of the formal program, then we'll go. We have some questions here, and in the interest of efficiency, we don't want to go over time. So what can you offer in terms of best practices that you see in terms of trailer maintenance and just getting the maximum life out of that trailer safely?
I think a lot of what we've seen is consistency of maintenance. I think trailers are the redheaded stepchild, if you will, of most fleets. They tend to get ignored. And I think that lack of maintenance ultimately turns into some very large repairs. Example, lack of greasing landing gear. I can't tell you how many times that we see that, especially on the independent repair side, that we're doing road calls, for example, very expensive road calls to replace landing gear just from a lack of grease. So I think that's really ultimately it, is just whatever maintenance schedule you choose, you have to stick to it religiously.
Okay, very good. All right, I'm going to turn to the Q&A portion here so we can get through everyone's questions. And of course, there's still time. If you do have a question, feel free to enter it in the chat, please. First question we'll ask, and this, I'm not sure who wants to handle it, but what are your thoughts of full service leases versus purchasing? Maybe we'll start with you, Adam.
Full service lease certainly has a place. I'll admit to working for a full service lease company for about 7 or 8 years, so I know it well. A full service lease is an all-in-one package. It can be very desirable. Accountants love full service lease because your costs are going to be straight line. all the way across. Downsides to full service lease, at the end of the day, it's kind of like an insurance policy. You're going to know that you're going to have an asset and that it's going to cost you the same for both the asset and the maintenance all the way through. To have that level of assurance, that's like having an insurance policy, and insurance policies carry premiums. So it costs a little bit more, but you get the assurance. You just need to know, is that right, fit for your application and perhaps your customers and your revenue streams, that sort of thing.
Okay, Brian, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know that you study lease vehicles too.
Sure. So Adam, I don't know if I could have said it any better. There's a premium to doing it. A lot of the large FSL, they make it very easy. We call it hitting the easy button, right? Comes at a cost. So what we typically recommend is going out there and understanding the true costs, separating the maintenance cost from the finance costs, and making sure that if you are going to pay that premium, you understand what that difference is between a purchase and a maintenance program, or even a finance and a maintenance program, right? And everything for us comes back to data. If that easy button, if you have enough revenue to cover that easy button, it's a good option. If you're looking for a way to control cost, if you're working for a way to understand maintenance costs separated from finance cost, there's probably a cheaper way to do it.
Okay. And Brian, we had a question here. Do your numbers regarding maintenance include tires?
So we actually typically exclude tires. Why? Because tire cost is going to be the same whether it's a new truck or an old truck, right? If you keep the existing truck and you run a new truck, yeah, I mean, you can get into, can you time the replacement to where the tires are going to wear out? In theory, maybe yes, but in functional application, no. So we remove tire cost, and we try to remove accident cost as well, because one or two large accidents can skew an individual year. And I don't care if a truck's, I guess you could say if it's new and it has enhanced safety versus an old truck, maybe there's a value there, but strictly from a cost perspective, we remove those two items.
Okay. All right, back to you, Adam. Do you consider driver turnover and safety technologies, and place a dollar amount to these key reasons on why to consider replacing aged equipment?
Certainly, yes. Driver turnover, for sure. Drivers, they have a very tough job, and in some cases, when they have interactions with maintenance personnel, the maintenance personnel can think that the driver's being a pain in the butt kind of thing. But I always try and make sure that my folks in my shops and in my fleet, that they understand what a driver goes through in a day, and that we're working together as a partnership, right? Without the driver, the truck isn't going to earn any revenue. And without the truck being, maintained and safe and operational, the driver's not going to earn any revenue. So we need each other. We absolutely need each other from a safety component and equipment standpoint. The latest technology is, it can be challenging. It's costly, but it can certainly save your bacon. Automatic braking systems can certainly help, and in some cases react when a driver hasn't reacted. Lane change assist systems can keep you safe and perhaps avoid a unsafe lane change, and that can turn into costs and claims. So yes, they come at a cost, but they can also save you costs. The key is, like we've talked about many times, knowing what those costs are, trying to keep them in a certain category so that you can evaluate, is that the overall right mix for your company and your mix of business?
Okay, very good. Peter, well, I'll direct this one to you, and then perhaps Brian, you can follow up. When historical data is no longer reflects current reality, what forecasting methods are most reliable?
I can call them reliable, just because honestly, you're guessing at that point. I mean, it may be an educated guess, but you're still guessing. And I think the most reliable thing you can do is have a real conversation with the decision makers. They're going to make a determination ultimately whether they keep a truck or dispose of it. And so I think all too often fleets do not talk to the maintenance department about whether or not it's viable to continue to maintain a series of trucks. Because generally speaking, when you buy trucks, you're buying them in lots. A series of trucks versus just having someone in an office or accounting, a C-level person, make that decision. So I think ultimately it comes down to communication.
Okay, anything to add, Brian?
Yeah, I would. So if you think about how to forecast maintenance costs, right? On that slide I showed that you start off at 2 cents and you end up at 10 or 12 cents by the end of its life cycle. One of the traps I see some of our customers fall into is they say, I'm going to add 2% to my budget this year, and that's going to be my goal for next year. They take in no consideration into how many pieces of equipment they're going to replace, how many they're going to extend, what that looks like. And the easy example I always give them is, let's assume all 500 of your trucks, you buy them all at once and you start in year one. In year two, does your maintenance organization fail because their costs double? Does it fail in year three? Does it fail in year four? Of course not. They're going through their life cycle and there's going to be costs. Now, obviously, no one buys 500 trucks and moves them through exactly the same, right? They're all over the place. You get 80 of these and 100 of these and 100 of these this model year. So if you're going to forecast and you're talking about when things aren't the same anymore, go back and look at historical change by model year, and that will get your costs a lot closer. So if your organization says, hey, I'm going to extend from 5 to 6 years, and we know that's going to bring you from $12,000 to $15,000 an asset, we need to make sure that we're planning an additional $3,000 per asset that you're going to extend to truly achieve your goals. And that's the only way you're going to be able to forecast and measure whether your team's performance was adequate or not, because it's not the goal line moves every year when you change your mix of by age.
Okay. This one is, I think, for you, Adam. Drum brake versus disc brake, truck and trailer. Higher repair costs, but greater efficiency. What's your preference?
My preference is yes. They both have their place. I mentioned previously that Northern Ontario run where, truck or trailer might break down outside of Nipigon. In years past, I would absolutely spec drums in that application because every shop, 100, 200 kilometers apart, they all have drums and shoes, 16.5 inch. It's a standard. These days, the discs are becoming more common and you can find them much more readily. Downtime that used to be a very big challenge for a disc brake failure in the middle of nowhere, it's not so much a thing anymore. I'm gonna fall back to my old college professor when I was taught how to be a mechanic way too many years ago. Pay me now or pay me later. You're gonna pay me. That was one of his favorite sayings. So when it comes to drums, you're gonna be replacing and fixing stuff, maxi chambers, and S-cams, shoes, and such, a bit more often. Discs a little bit less so, but when you do have to eventually replace those discs, they can be more expensive. That said, the environment also plays a factor. The discs oftentimes will seize up to the hubs when you do have to replace them and they get too thin, and then you're putting hubs on them as well up here in the Great White North. So you need to know what your data is. So we run both in our fleet and we have them in specific applications depending on what the need is for that particular customer. Like I said, the answer is both.
Okay. If I can just add one thing in there, James. I think, Adam, that's the right way to look at it. The piece I always go back to is if you look at the stopping distance enhancements that we've seen, the interactions with the full suite of safety options, about 80% of that reduced stopping comes from putting disc on the front. So if you're thinking about, how to mix and match and find that right sort of, layout for your fleet, front disc gives you about 80% of that shorter stopping distance. So as you're playing with that, something to know and something to kind of help you say, okay, if it's a little bit painful and there's a little extra cost, I'd rather run drum, maybe run disc in the front and drum on the rest, because at least you get 80% of the value.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question here in about a minute and a half or so. Thanks for all the great information. Do you advise looking into the used market to potentially keep an overall fleet age younger right now, or are there too many other traps with those vehicles? Who would like to take that one?
Yeah, I'll talk to it. Sure. To my mind, it depends on the opportunity. With the supply restrictions that happened, during COVID and then the post-COVID boom, and now we're in the low cycle of the market, we're in a place where there is excess capacity, right? That's driving down prices, and that's continued longer than anybody expected. As a result of that, some fleets are having a hard time staying viable, and then blocks of equipment become available for purchase. You got to look to see whether or not that block of equipment fits your application. and whether or not it's, what is it at the right stage of its life cycle, depending on what you require. It can certainly be viable, but, as with all things, know your market. There are some bargains to be had out there, but there's also some pitfalls, like you said. So make sure that if you are looking at some used equipment, that you get an appropriate inspection on that equipment, and that you really know what you're getting into. Maintenance history is a big key. Know how it was maintained.
Yeah. Adam, Brian, Peter, thank you very much. I'd like to thank you each for sharing your expertise with us today. To all those who have registered, you'll be receiving a recording of this webinar in case you missed it. We'll also have it on trucknews.com for future viewing. And we'll be leaving with a short survey. We ask you to fill that out if you could. And I want to conclude by saying a big thank you to our webinar sponsor, Full Bay. So thank you very much, and I appreciate you all joining us today.